Hi students, we're continuing to think about taste using Susan Sontag's essay Notes on Camp and Roger Scruton's essay The Great Swindle. So Roger Scruton was a British philosopher who recently died in 2020, and he did political philosophy and a lot of philosophy of art, and he was known for being very conservative and very traditional. He saw his role as trying to uphold old traditions in the light of all sorts of new movements, which you can tell from his essay, he really doesn't like contemporary philosophy very much. In The Great Swindle, which he wrote in 2012 for a general audience, it's published in the online magazine Aeon, he attacks kitsch and all these sort of kitschy art movements that we see in the 20th and 21st century. And he says that this is essentially fake culture. It's not high culture. And for Scruton, the point of art is to develop high culture, which instills a sense of tradition and kind of connects us to the past and is dedicated to the true, the good, and the beautiful. So Scruton does not like contemporary art because he sees it as being too kitschy. I assigned a Jeff Koons video so you can get a sense of one of the artists that Scruton is criticizing. He's also not happy with artists like Duchamp, who in 1917 put a urinal in the art museum, right? Which is funny, it's kind of a joke. And then Damien Hirst is a contemporary artist that Scruton also calls out for putting pickled fish in museums. And so we see that there's a lot of different artists that Scruton is pointing at as not taking art seriously and not contributing to high culture in the way that he thinks they should. He says that high culture is the self-consciousness of a society, right? It's like the higher self of a society. And he says that high culture itself is precarious. It's not something we should take for granted. It's an achievement, and it's a difficult achievement that doesn't sustain itself. He says it only endures if it's underpinned by a sense of tradition and a broad endorsement of surrounding social norms. So for Scruton, he thinks that art is the highest expression of society, of what we can be, and it's also something that we need to carefully preserve a sense of. He is appealing to a certain concept of art that we get from the Romantics. So this would be the 18th, 19th century Germans and English. And he said that for the Romantics, the work of art was the result of a unique and irreplaceable experience containing a revelation. So the Romantics were obsessed with the notion of beauty and the sublime, which they saw as something that connects us to the larger world, that kind of uplifts us. And it's a transcendent type of experience. And it is like the height of what it means to be human. So the Romantics loved art and thought that art was very important for discovering what is true. So they connected the beautiful to the true and the good. And this was something that was important for society. So this is the notion of art that Scruton wants to have. The other thing that the Romantics did is they connected this idea of the work of art that is beautiful or sublime to the cult of genius. That means there has to be an artist who is a genius, who has a special skill that places them above other people, and they can kind of manifest this beauty in their artistic medium. Scruton says the cult of genius gave art a new place at the center of intellectual life. And this has to do with the artwork as an original gesture, a revelation of the unique personality who had broken through all conventional forms of expression to provide a direct experience of the inner self. And so Scruton's very interested in this idea that there's sort of conventions and there's sort of this thing that art has to break through. Art is special. It's expressing what is most inner and sacred about humanity. This is why he doesn't like kitsch. He sees kitsch as kind of being superficial expressions of emotion. So he says that kitsch is a cult of fakery, not a cult of genius, a cult of fake emotions. He says kitsch is designed to put emotion on sale. It works as advertisements work, creating a fantasy world in which everything, love included, can be purchased, and in which every emotion is simply one item in an infinite line of substitutes. The cliched kiss, the doe-eyed smile, the Christmas card sentiments, All advertise what cannot be advertised without ceasing to be. They commit the salesman to nothing. So he is essentially saying that kitschy campy art is very fake and it's trying to sell you something in a very superficial way that commits the artist to nothing. They just are creating glitz and glam to draw your attention, not really providing deeper insights into human nature. And this is bad. He says that he doesn't think art is really achieving what it's supposed to anymore. And we do see these trends in the art world, right? If we look at something from the Italian Renaissance, it's like beauty is worshipped. There's all these images of Venus who represents beauty and her birth. And it's this metaphor for art and what it means to sort of create anything that's artistic. It's sort of like giving birth to beauty. There's all sorts of imagery around the worship of beauty in older art. And if you look at how Warhol handles art, right, he comes from this advertising background. And so for him, an ad and a great work of art are no different from each other. And that's one of the things he continually did in his art was turn images like Botticelli's Venus into something that looks a little bit more like an ad, right? So he's making it kitschy. He's making these traditional images of beauty kitschy. So Scruton doesn't like camp. He doesn't like kitsch. He thinks it's fake. He thinks it's bad for us. Susan Sontag is going to give us a different perspective. In her essay Notes on Camp in 1964, right, so this is an older essay as well. She says that I am strongly drawn to camp and almost as strongly offended by it. So she's a little ambivalent towards camp, and she's going to parse it out differently than Scruton does. Susan Sontag is probably a name that's familiar to her, familiar to you, because she's one of the most important critics of the 20th century. She wrote many many essays on many different topics in the arts, including photography. She's a prolific writer. And she also was a novelist, a filmmaker, and an activist. So her essay is taking up camp, right? Which she says she's fascinated by, but also not sure. You know, there's a little repulsion there too. And camp is exaggerated, it's theatrical, it's hyper stylized. At the time that she's writing this essay, probably the best example of camp would be like Elvis musicals or just musicals in general, because they're so opulent, they're so colorful, they're so over the top, they're so like melodramatic. A contemporary example of camp, which you might be familiar with, is it was the theme for the 2019 Met Gala. And I assigned a short video so you can see some of this imagery. Camp is very much about extravagance, like over the top, in your face, colorful patterns, just eye grabbing. That's what camp is. So the way that Sontag describes camp is she says it's a sensibility, it's a particular aesthetic, it's a way of seeing the world. So we can see the world through the eyes of camp. And it's a particular way of looking that she finds fascinating. So she says that camp sees everything in quotation marks. It's not a lamp, but a lamp. It's not a woman, but a woman. To perceive camp in objects and persons is to understand being as playing a role. It is the furthest extension and sensibility of the metaphor of life as a theater. So this is a really interesting way to think about camp because it is playing off of its own appearance, right? So the quotation marks kind of bracket something and draw your attention to its appearance in a way that is playing off this sort of superficiality, like this is playing a role. This is what a lamp is. This is what a woman is. But it's so hyper exaggerated, it's almost self-consciously ironic. And so that irony comes in with this idea that we play a role. You're doing something very deliberately to play this role as a woman. And I think Dolly Parton is a really good example of camp. Cher is also considered really campy, but I love Dolly Parton so much. And I think a lot of people really love Dolly Parton because she has that campy appeal, right? So she's not just a cowgirl, she's a cowgirl. She's not just wearing a disco outfit, she's really going for it, right? Everything's very exaggerated. And there's so many interviews with Dolly Parton where she talks about the sort of exaggerated femininity that she adopted as part of her style and why she did it. And also how she understands why people might think she's superficial, but she's like very genuine about it. So there's something about camp that feels superficial, but it is asserting something. It's playing a role. It's seeing ourselves as playing a role in this world and doing it in a very exaggerated way. Sontag says that the hallmark of camp is the spirit of extravagance. And she's thinking about it in terms of the queer community, right? She's writing this in 1964. And we can look at all these examples of how the LGBTQIA community has adopted camp in sort of transgressive and interesting ways. There's Paris is Burning, there's RuPaul's Drag Race, there's all sorts of ways that this sort of performance of femininity or performance, like over exaggerated performance of something, has become a tool of artistic expression. And so we can look at these different examples of camp and think about how camp is being used and why is the spirit of extravagance important, or why is it being used? She says that when we're thinking about camp, it's playing around with taste in an interesting way. Sometimes people think there's just good taste and bad taste. Either you have taste or you don't taste. You don't have taste. And Sontag is telling us that there exists a good taste of bad taste. I think this is what we engage in when we watch these sort of movies that are so bad they're good, these sort of cult movies that became super popular because they're so watchable. And Dead Alive is my favorite example of this. Peter Jackson, before he directed these super serious Lord of the Rings movies, right? This, very important movie franchise from a classic book series that was wildly popular, but is very serious. His previous movies are completely ridiculous and silly. Dead Alive is the goriest, silliest zombie movie I've ever seen in my life. Don't watch it if if you faint around gore. It's ridiculous, but it's such a good movie. And you can kind of see how Peter Jackson has this good taste of bad taste. He really knows what to do with things that are considered bad taste. And the way that Sontag also describes camp is that it's dethroning the serious, right? It's taking what's serious and it's overthrowing it. It's calling it into question. It's kind of making fun of it. And it's doing this by being playful and anti-serious. So she says that camp involves a new, more complex relation to the serious. One can be serious about the frivolous and frivolous about the serious. And there's a lot of campy movies like Rocky Horror Picture Show where we see the campy movie making fun of something that is taken super seriously in mainstream sort of culture. So Rocky Horror Picture Show is the 70s, and they're making fun of kind of like heteronormative monogamous relationships and marriage in America. So Sontag is essentially trying to point out that aesthetic taste is more complex than we typically think about it. It's not just that there's high culture and good taste, and that's the only thing that aesthetics should focus on. She says that there's other aspects of culture and there's other aspects of our life. And she argues that if we only look at high culture and beautiful art and masterpieces that elevate the beautiful and the serious, and we ignore things like camp, then we're essentially cheating ourselves out of part of what it means to be human. We shouldn't have respect for only one style or one type of culture because we do all sorts of things and enjoy all sorts of things in our life. And so our aesthetic concepts and our discussions should be as broad as our actual tastes are. And to help you think a little bit more about this idea of whether great art needs to be beautiful, I assigned this video from the art assignment about this idea of, is art beautiful? Does it have to be beautiful? Why did art kind of become a challenge to beauty instead of elevating beauty as it did in the past? I hope that you find these readings and this video interesting, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on them. Thank you so much.